but not a drop to drink. In other words, there's sugar everywhere, there's tons of sugar everywhere, but if they can't get it into the cells, it's not doing them any good. And that's why diabetes is really sort of a wasting disease. You've got all this sugar there, but you just can't use it, and so that's the basis of the whole disease. Just the opposite, when blood sugars decline, then your alpha cells release glucagon, which stimulates glucose to be released by the liver. Now, do you remember how sugar is stored in the liver? What form is it stored in? What?
Glycogen.
Glycogen. What is glycogen?
Glucose.
It's glucose, but it's long strings that have been of glucose that have been hooked together. Okay. So yeah, so that's where the sugar comes from, and so the glucagon can cause the breakdown of glycogen, turn it into sugar so that you can use it. We call that glycogenolysis, glycogen lysis, right? Cutting it up into sugar molecules. Okay. Insulin is a drug you really should understand. It's a hormone, peptide hormone, so it's a protein type hormone released by the beta cells. It affects target cells, but basically it affects every cell in your body, because every cell in your body needs sugar in it to manufacture ATP and to repair itself and so forth. So it does all of these things for you. When you have high blood sugar and you're making more insulin, it's also causing you to take that sugar out of circulation and form it into glycogen and store it in the liver. Where else do you store glycogen besides the liver? In your muscles. Muscles, yeah. Fat's a different thing, right? Yeah. Amino acids absorption, it makes a lot of things work for you. I mean, insulin really makes it all work right. It stimulates triglyceride formation in adipose tissue. And remember, triglycerides are the form in which fat is stored. So when you look at that yellow stuff that's underneath your skin and on your tummy, that is stored triglycerides. And you remember what triglycerides look like? I'm sorry, I'm getting into chemistry here a little bit. But remember, a triglyceride is a glycerol molecule at one end, and it has 3 long fatty acids attached to it. Thus, it's called a triglyceride. Okay, glucagon is basically sort of the opposite of insulin. I'm just going to slide over that because I think I've said enough about it. Now, in kind of wrap up here, there's lots of other hormones that we have in our body. I mentioned this at the beginning, and we're not going to really talk about them in this chapter. But our intestines have a lot of hormones in them that make one part of the intestine squeeze down more. We have hormones that make our gallbladder contract. Our kidneys, we have a bunch of hormones that make us, kind of like one of them is aldosterone, we talked a little bit about, but there's lots of others. The heart has its own set of hormones that control the amount of volume that we have on board. Our thymus lives in our chest. It helps out in our immunity, and thus the T cells, those are thymus lymphocytes basically, that are so important in patients with AIDS, that they have enough T cells because they need to be able to fight infections, and without T cells they can't. Our gonads make lots of hormones. Gonads is kind of a generic term, which is testicles in men, ovaries in women, and both of those make, both male and female hormones are made by both organs. And I think I'm just going to say this again, because I don't really want to talk about it anymore. This is just a kind of quick review of that calcitriol thing. I'll let you look that over. Testes make testosterone, which is the most important male hormone. Inhibin is a hormone that's made by the sustentacular cells. These are cells that are in the gonad, in the testes, and they cause the sperm cells to be created, turned into sperm cells, and then for them to physically mature. When we get to the reproductive system, you'll learn just how complex it is to make a sperm cell, and also just how complex it is to make an egg. Ovaries, same deal here. Estrogens, makes lots of estrogens, also makes progesterone. Progesterone is the other female hormone. Birth control pills, for those of you who might like to know what you're taking once in a while. Birth control pills are a combination of low doses of estrogens and low doses of progesterone. And it doesn't really take very much to screw up the whole cascade effect that occurs in the monthly cycle. So if you take a little bit of estrogen when you're supposed to be not making estrogen, you don't ovulate, and that's the whole deal with birth control pills. We'll talk more about that when we get to the reproductive system. I think I mentioned this one the other day. Our fat tissues, I have 31% body fat, so I make lots of leptin and lots of resistin. This resistin is important because it makes your insulin not work very well, and that's why so many people in America that are overweight are diabetic. That's a type 2 diabetes, which is basically caused, but your body's still making insulin, it just can't make enough to overcome this resistance of these hormones made by your fat. A couple of others just to mention sort of in passing. Growth hormone, GH. GH affects lots of organs in your body. It affects your your bones and your muscles and so forth. Thyroid hormones are very important in growth, and there's the rest of them. I think we've kind of talked about them. But growth is kind of that would be a great essay question, is to write what are all the hormones that have to do with your growth and development. And clearly, when any of these hormones are missing, people don't develop properly. And I think maybe we have some examples of that. If you are a child and you don't have enough growth hormone, you end up being a midget or a dwarf, or you simply don't develop. Usually, if they don't have enough growth hormone really early in life, sometimes they don't even develop their brain properly. Growth hormone is important in adults. It helps with your glucose concentration and mobilizes your lipid reserves. I was flying on an American Airlines plane a while back. You guys have probably seen this too. And in the back, there's all these advertisements. And there's this one of like a 75-year-old guy, and he's all ripped, and he's standing there like this, and he's got perfectly defined muscles and so forth. And he says, if you want to look like me, come to this clinic in Arizona. And this is what they're giving out. They're giving out growth hormone shots, and they're giving out testosterone shots for guys who want to look like that at an older age, because at an older age you're not really making much growth hormone, you're probably not making that much testosterone either. So you go in there and pay them a ton of money, and they give you shots of all that stuff. This is something you need to know. You need to know that thyroid hormones are very important during growth and development and during pregnancy. One of the first things you ladies will get when you go in for your first obstetrics visit, if you find yourself pregnant and you go to the doctor, one of the first rounds of blood tests he's going to draw on you will include a thyroid level. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone in your body, your baby doesn't have enough thyroid hormone in their body. If they don't have enough thyroid hormone in their body, they do not develop properly. And these kids will be almost universally severely mentally retarded. So it's a blood test that's pretty worthwhile. If your thyroid doesn't work before puberty, you may not grow and you may end up being really short. That's the last I mentioned there. All of these hormones interact with each other. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. And the main reason that men are bigger than women is only one thing. It's not growth hormone or thyroid hormone or anything. It's testosterone levels. Testosterone is a growth hormone in many ways, and that's why men are always bigger. They have heavier bones. They have heavier muscles. They obviously have secondary sexual characteristics, but women have their own set of those. But these reproductive hormones account for all of that. But always remember that the reason men are bigger is because of testosterone. And the other side of that is as you ladies get older, you've probably been told that, oh, you're going to go through menopause and you're going to get osteoporosis and your bones are going to get weak and all that stuff. And that is all true. And the reason it's true is because you don't have any testosterone at that time in your life. And if you had some testosterone, you wouldn't get as much osteoporosis. But most women don't really want to go around with beards and hair growing in all kinds of funny places. So this all caused by hormones. Just a kind of summary slide. A couple of diseases that you probably ought to know about. One of them is called Cushing's disease. Dr. Cushing was a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins University back in the early 1900s, kind of the father of neurosurgery, and he came up with this disease called Cushing's disease. They named it after him, and it's nothing but way too much glucocorticoids. It usually came from a tumor up in the pituitary gland, thus the neurosurgeon is the guy who figured it out. The opposite of Cushing's disease is called Addison's disease, which is not enough steroids. This is what they thought John F. Kennedy had. He had very low levels of steroids. He had this doctor that would come to the White House once or twice or 3 times a week. Everybody on the staff called him Dr. Feelgood. Dr. Feelgood would come in and give John F. Kennedy shots. And what he was giving him shots of was steroids. And it made him feel better. Steroids make you feel better. You know, Mark McGuire and all the Barry Bonds and all those guys, they felt really good because steroids make you feel good. Now, in the short term, not in the long term. But anyway, so Addison's disease is not enough. Cushing's disease is too much. This is a really interesting disease called pheochromocytoma. I only operated on 2 patients in my whole career that had a pheochromocytoma. It's a tumor that occurs in the adrenal gland, and it releases way too much epinephrine and norepinephrine. And it's really fascinating. These people have a very high metabolic rate, very high blood pressure, very high heart rate, very high elevated glucose levels because they're just dumping epinephrine into their body all the time. And so you operate to take the tumors out, the tumors in their adrenal. And it's pretty exciting because just touching the tumor can cause their blood pressure to go up to 300 over 170. So you kind of, in the surgery books, we always said you dissect the patient away from the tumor instead of ever touching the tumor. I'll just leave the rest of those. Let's talk just a second about this. This is the last part of the chapter. It's called the general adaptation syndrome. And I think this is not presented very well in your book. I had a hard time understanding it the first time I read it. But just to simplify it, basically the general adaptation syndrome is how we respond to stress. Okay, it's the stress response. The stress response is divided into 3 phases. The first is the alarm phase. The second is the resistance phase, where our body does everything we can to fight that stress. And the third stage is called the exhaustion phase. And the exhaustion phase always leads to death. If your body has done everything you can to fight off some stress and you can't fight it off, and you get exhausted, you've burned up all your resources trying to fight it off, you're gonna die. Okay? So when you go and start reading this chapter, realize that that's what these three things mean. Now, just for a quick summary, the alarm phase is basically the fight or flight. You know, you got injured, you got hit on the head, you got a big cut on you, and your body does everything it can in the fight or flight phase to overcome that. So your blood pressure squeezes down, you have general sympathetic activation of all your fight or flight things. Your brain stimulates your renal medulla, releases epinephrine, norepinephrine. Those bring your blood pressure up, bring your heart rate up. Do once again everything you can to fight off this problem. And then that's the immediate response, and then it gets a little more long term. So then you start saying, well, okay, we've stayed alive. We didn't bleed so much that we bled to death right away. And then what can we do now to continue to resist and get over this injury that we had? And the brain stimulates the kidney. The kidney releases renin, which you haven't learned about yet. Renin releases angiotensin. That works to have your body hang on to all the salt and all the water and everything you can to help fight it. Your ACTH starts causing your body to release a whole bunch of glucocorticoids, a bunch of steroids to help you fight the problem. The pancreas starts releasing a lot of glucagon to raise your blood sugars to help you fight off these things. Your body starts to recover with growth hormone, so your body secretes a bunch of extra growth hormone. Just as an aside, Andy Pettitte was a pitcher for the New York Yankees. And Andy Pettitte was a great pitcher for 25 or 30 years, or 20 years, let's just say. And towards the end of his career, he broke his ankle. And the ankle was having a hard time healing. So he went to his orthopedist, and the orthopedist says, well, I think you ought to take this growth hormone. It'll help your ankle heal. Well, that would be kind of fitting in right here, you know. You've got this injury, we're trying to heal it. And so our body releases more growth hormone. Well, Andy Pettitte took a bunch of growth hormone. Only, unfortunately, growth hormone is a performance-enhancing drug. And so he got caught on a urine test, and he said, well, wait a minute, I wasn't taking it to improve my performance, I was just taking it to heal my ankle. And they gave him a little suspension, but it wasn't very much. And but the point being is that not only does growth hormone make you get bigger and stronger if you're going to be a big athlete, but it also helps you repair things. The exhaustion phase is when everything starts going to hell. You've exhausted all your fats. You've given up. Your kidney is starting to suffer more and more. Your adrenal glands are out of glucocorticoids. You don't have any more steroid hormones to release into the system to help you to keep you going. Pretty soon you get to where you can't control your sodium and you can't control your volume. You go into heart failure. You go into lung failure, and you die. Okay, so that's the exhaustion phase. I don't know why they don't just call it organ failure or near death or whatever, but they call it the exhaustion phase.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So let's take two case in point. So you're talking about on the physical level. Could this also be a mental and emotional level? Say somebody had a traumatic childhood and they're used to that resistance phase and all of those hormones. Mm-hmm. And then you had somebody that had a fairly normal childhood and they end up going through something kind of emotionally, mentally traumatic. And then can you parallel mental and emotional along those lines?
Yeah, I think, if we're happy and healthy, we're probably in hormone balance. I mean, there's no question, that's part of it. So my answer is yes, I think that it is related.
Because I had somebody that had something happen to him, and when he got to the exhaustion phase, like he literally was laying on the floor, completely puking, and bowels were
Out of it,
loose. Yeah.
My only comment would be, it may be some neurologic disorder, or it may have been some psychiatric disorder. But does it happen in these? Yeah. I mean, people that are in the ICU that start to fail, the first thing that fails is usually their head, and they're out of it. But because you're breathing for them and you've got them in bed, you know, you don't really analyze all that stuff that much as they go down the tubes, as we say, going down the tubes. Okay? All right, now, obviously I talked about a lot of hormones there that are not extensively covered on this chapter. So I think if you know the things that I talked about them, you know, like the pineal gland makes melatonin, and what melatonin does is help you sleep. You know, there are so many of them you don't really need to know a ton about. I actually thought I had a few more slides, because I haven't seen my slides of my cases. That's the end of it. Okay, I'll find them. All right, we have 20 minutes left, and I'm not willing to waste it, so I'm going to start on the next chapter. But I will tell you that as of this point, this is the end of what will be covered on the second test. Even though the second test isn't for another 13 days, this is the end of the material. We'll continue. We haven't gotten into any of this in the lab yet. This is kind of a heavy laboratory exam, by the way, because there's a lot of microscope slides that I've showed you. And you need to know what the thyroid looks like. You need to know what the adrenal gland looks like. You need to know what the pituitary gland looks like. And then you need to know that big graph with all the different hormones and what controls them and so forth. So don't let that sneak up on you. Be sure and use your time in lab wisely to do the things that you can't do when you're at home. I think that's always, that always bothers me when I see a number of students that are kind of sitting around in lab, either working on their computer or reading their book or studying or something like that, but they aren't studying the stuff they need to do in lab, because you only get a certain amount of time in lab. And you know, we've got about $250,000 worth of stuff in that lab for you. Please use it. Those models, a lot of those models cost $10,000. In fact, the body models, the little torso guys that have all the organs that come out, those things are $30,000. The PCC has invested tons of money. Those microscopes are $1,500 a piece. You know, there's hundreds and hundreds of slides over there, some of which are cheap, about $6 a piece. Some of them are very expensive, depending on what it is. So please avail yourself of all of that. Use it and use your time wisely. I know you have Open Lab. You can come to that too, but there's no use to twiddle away the time that we have in lab every day. Questions, comments? Does that make sense? All right. So the last section, the last third of 232 is about the heart and the blood, okay? And the way we do that is we start with the blood, the liquid that's going to get pumped around, and then we talk about the heart, which is the pump that pumps it around, and then we talk about the vascular system, which is all the pipes that carry it around, and then the last thing we talk about is the lymphatic system and how we fight infections and stuff last day. So let's start here with this one. There will be blood. And blood carries a lot of connotations in our society. If you watched any of those Halloween movies last week that were on TV, it seemed like I didn't see any of them. I don't watch that stuff, but there's always lots of blood in it, right? And we talk about blood like it's some special golden liquor or something, but Miss Frizzle talks about blood. She drives the school bus through the blood system. Looking back, we saw a white blood cell chasing the bus. We'll be safer with the red blood cells, kids. The red cells won't eat you up, but the white cells will. So anyway, My Bloody Valentine. This is my introduction to blood. Anybody read this book, In Cold Blood? Truman Capote won all kinds of awards for writing this book, and he's a really weird dude. I think he's dead now. But he wrote this book in great detail about the murder of a whole family in Kansas. It's like one of the first ever mass murders. It was a house invasion kind of thing. It was amazingly, it was a factual book, but anyway. That was the name of it, In Cold Blood. Blood diamonds, get them while they're still cruel. Blood buddies. There's the blood drive is today here on campus. If you if you want to donate blood, you can walk over there and do it. It was yesterday too. I think I didn't realize it was going to be yesterday. This is what a unit of blood looks like in a plastic bag. You see it's typed. We're going to learn about blood typing. The blood it's always venous blood, so it's not bright red. It's actually, that's kind of dark blood, whether you believe it or not. We'll learn a lot about the components of blood and so forth. The bloody sock. You guys remember the story of the bloody sock? We've got a Game 7 of the World Series tonight. That doesn't come along every day. It's pretty exciting because I don't think there's ever been a World Series where two teams the Cubs haven't won in 117 years, and the Cleveland Indians haven't won since 1948. So these are two teams playing a one-game series now for the whole ball of wax. And of course, the Red Sox hadn't won in 86 years when they won. This was back in 2005, I think, maybe 2003. And Curt Schilling was the pitcher. And I remember watching this game because, you see, he had a bloody sock. And the reason he did was because he tore a ligament in his ankle here about 6 days before him pitching here in the World Series. And they operated on this ligament and put a few stitches in it, and then they let him pitch. And as he was pitching, he ripped the wound open, and it started bleeding. And I can tell you that if the cameras zoomed in on that bloody sock once during that game, they zoomed in on it 75 times. They said, well, how's the blood coming? Is he bleeding more? The guy just kept pitching. He pitched like 8 innings that game. And it was amazing. But anyway, the bloody sock is now in the Hall of Fame. If you ever go to Cooperstown, New York, you can see it. Oh, that's not so bad, huh? All right, so this is kind of a quick summary of what the next 4 chapters are going to be about. We're going to start by talking about the blood, which is the stuff that gets pumped around. Remember that the heart pumps the blood twice. First of all, it pumps it out. And goes to the lungs. From the lungs, it comes back to the heart. And then from the heart, it goes out to every cell in the body. And then it comes back to the heart again. And it does that over and over and over and over again, about every 90 seconds. And so we study the heart in detail. We study the tubes, the blood vessels, the arteries, and the veins. And then we study the physiology of what makes the heart pump more and pump less, have a higher blood pressure, lower blood pressure, and all that kind of stuff. Real quick, let's talk about whole blood. When you think of blood, you think of the blood that pours out of you when you get cut. And that's true. The thing you need to realize about blood is that it's actually made up of a number of components. And just so I continue to write on the board. If you take a tube of blood and you put it in a test tube and you let it sit there, it will separate out. Now, in real life, in a medical laboratory, they don't wait there for it to sit out, to separate out. They put it in a centrifuge, and we will do this in lab ourselves with our own blood, if you like, and spin it down and separate out the different parts of the blood, because they just separate pretty easily. So, if we go back and think about this test tube with blood in it, and here's the tube, and we started by filling it up with blood up to here, so it was all nice and red, and then we spin that thing a bunch of times for 5 minutes or so, and it separates out. And what it separates out to is this part down here becomes very deep red, and that's where the red cells are. And then there's a little layer right in here, which is kind of whitish. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. It's called the buffy coat. That's basically where the white cells and the platelets go. And then the top part up here is pure yellow, kind of golden colored, and that's plasma. That's just the water that is in the blood. And so the plasma is the top. You see it contains water mostly. Some plasma proteins are dissolved in there. There's a bunch of other solutes like sodium and chloride and all the electrolytes and so forth. And then there's the formed elements, and this is the formed elements. These two layers down here are the formed elements, and there are 3 kinds of formed elements, and those are the RBCs, the WBCs, which are the white blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and then the platelets. They're tiny little cells that live, I'm spelling that very wrong, platelets, that are in there as well. Platelets, think of them as little blood clotters, and they kind of grab onto their friends. They all hold together to form a clot. That's what platelets, that's their function. That's their function. So these are called the formed elements, and I think if you just get this first bit of understanding, then it makes, everything starts to make more sense. So, there's the formed elements that go to the bottom, there's the plasma that goes to the top, and there's a whole lot of numbers associated with all of this stuff. And one thing that I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give you not ranges of numbers, I'm going to give you a single set of numbers, okay? And just know that men are a little bit different than women, and old people are different, and people that live at high altitude are a little different because they have more red cells to carry more oxygen. But anyway, the numbers that I'm going to teach you are that our blood is 55% plasma, and it is 45% blood cells. Okay? So that's one.